Caitlin Huey-Burns is on Capitol Hill. She is a CBSN political contributor and national political reporter for Real Clear Politics. She joins me now. Caitlin, former Secretary of State John Kerry had a scathing response to President Trump. He said it was, quote, disgraceful and destructive, and said it hurt America's reputation abroad. What might the consequences be from this approach the president is taking to the NATO allies?
Well, I think that is a big question that we have to see how it will be answered. The president here is operating on much of the rhetoric and campaign promises he made while running for president. This kind of idea that putting America first, why are we spending all of this money when our allies aren't pulling their own weight? That was a message that really resonated with his base of support, and he is applying that now. There is a question, though, about what the consequences will be. We've seen past presidents, Obama and Bush, make similar pleas to NATO to increase their own spending on defense, and we saw that agreement made in 2014, as Major Garrett laid out there. So Donald Trump is not the first president to push allies to spend more and to agree to more. What's different here is a couple of things. One, the rhetoric is certainly very different. It's much more aggressive, and he kind of hit the ground running on this as he landed in Brussels for this all-important summit. The second distinguishing factor is the backdrop of Russia. Remember, this alliance and this agreement of 2% of GDP spending was made after Russia invaded Ukraine. And the president, of course, after this is going to be meeting one-on-one with Putin. He's been talking more favorably about Putin than his predecessors have. And so that backdrop here is very significant and a differentiating factor, and also of concern to those allies here there at NATO.
Well, and also one has to question the president's commitment to NATO at all. I mean, a very recent tweet that just came out says, what good is NATO if Germany is paying Russia billions of dollars for gas and energy? Why are there only 5 out of 29 countries that have met their commitment? The U.S. is paying for Europe's protection, then loses billions on trade, must pay 2% of GDP immediately, not by 2025. So he starts out that tweet by asking, what good is NATO if, right? So, Caitlin, and it makes you question, what is his goal? What is its ultimate goal here?
Right. It's a great question. And is it simply to talk tough in terms of rhetoric, or is he meaning to follow through with some of these threats? Now, I can tell you up here on Capitol Hill, lawmakers do not want to mess with NATO, but you do hear from some Republicans saying that, you know, what the president is saying is not too far off base. There is concern with the language he's using, of course. Then you have some others, even in the Republican Party, very concerned from a foreign policy perspective about the way in which the president is talking about our allies versus the way in which he is talking about the leaders of Russia, North Korea, etc. So that's the big question here, is what the president actually intends.
And Caitlin, during the exchange with NATO Secretary General, President Trump took issue with Germany's reliance of oil from Russia. Now, Russia has defended that by saying it's simply cheaper for them to buy the Russian oil than the U.S. oil. But that aside, the president will be meeting with Vladimir Putin on Monday. So after today, are allies less concerned about that meeting or more so?
I think that they are still concerned, given the kind of public commentary that we've seen. And I think the president's intentions there were, even though they're that statement, of course, is very controversial, especially given Germany's history with the Soviet Union. I think the intent or the goal there was first to kind of shift the criticism of his own relationship with Russia back to Germany, and also to build up again that pressure on Germany that he's been trying to build up to pay more in terms of that NATO defense agreement.
You know, it's so interesting, Caitlin, because the NATO summit, so much of it is about optics. So number one, it was interesting to see the president sort of take the allies to task publicly. And number two, it was interesting to see President Trump walking with Turkish President Erdogan behind the other world leaders. I mean, Erdogan is essentially the most autocratic leader of the bunch. So what did you make of that?
Well, I think a lot of people are paying attention to the optics here, especially given what we were just talking about, which is the contrast that we see in terms of the president's approach to allies versus his approach to more controversial leaders known for really, unsavory and, have come under their own criticism. Of course, Erdogan, a really good example of that. He's also talked favorably about Putin, as we know, and he's talked favorably about the North Korean leader. We're just over a month since that meeting. And so I think the optics here are really important, and again, raising the question of why the president is doing what he's doing, at least in terms of rhetoric at this point.
All right, so let's talk about the escalating trade conflict between the U.S. and China for a moment. U.S. officials have announced plans to impose 10% tariffs on another $200 billion of Chinese goods. Here's what Speaker Paul Ryan had to say about this earlier.
Yeah, I don't want to hamstring the president's negotiating tactics, but I've long said I don't think tariffs are the right way to go. I think there are absolutely legitimate unfair trade practices, particularly by China, that we and our allies should be confronting. So that is important to point out that China does steal intellectual property. They do engage in unfair trade practices, which violate not just the spirit but the letter of the WTO standards that they agreed to play by years ago. So I think we're right to point that out. I just don't think tariffs are the right mechanism to do that.
So we heard him saying he didn't think tariffs are the right mechanism. It seems that many in Congress share that view, are against the president's trade policy. But does anyone in Congress have the appetite to do anything about it?
It's a great question. As you noted, this is a key policy difference between Republicans on Capitol Hill and the Republican in the White House. It is over the issue of trade. They've long sparred over it, and tariffs are certainly an example of that. I will say today, as we speak, the Senate is working on a vote to impose restrictions on the president's ability to issue these tariffs to make them kind of go through Congress.
It's non-binding. I
just
want to point out that we're looking at a live picture right now of President Trump and the First Lady en route to the family photo op in Brussels. Please continue.
Right. So as they're there, lawmakers are here on the Hill, and on the Senate side, they are working on a vote to curb the president's ability to issue such kind of tariffs. Now, this is going to be a non-binding resolution, but it does provide an example of the contrast that we see in terms of what lawmakers here think about these tariffs versus what the president says. I will, however, note that even allies on Capitol Hill of the president's in the party say that they want to give the president a little bit of room to kind of see how this goes. They're not quite ready to call this a trade war, but certainly the concerns are apparent.